Consciousness, we have been taught, is supposed to be nothing more than a side effect of the brain, a fleeting spark that vanishes when neurons stop firing. That is the foundation of materialism. If materialism is correct, then consciousness has no causal power of its own. It does not shape reality, it merely passively reflects the physical processes occurring within the brain. But the problem is, reality doesn't seem to agree. What happens when science uncovers things it cannot explain? What happens when the mind defies the laws that materialism insists must govern it? Time and time again, we encounter evidence that defies materialist assumptions, evidence that suggests consciousness does not simply emerge from the physical world, but actively shapes it. It's becoming clear that the mind is not a passive observer of reality, it is an intrinsic force that participates in its creation. The cracks in materialism are getting wider, and today we're going to explore some of the biggest anomalies that reveal just how wrong the mainstream narrative is. What happens when belief alone heals an illness? When knowledge spreads throughout an entire species without direct transmission, and when life's fundamental structures organize themselves into impossible patterns? Let's investigate these anomalies, phenomena that should not exist if consciousness were simply an illusion of the brain. We'll begin with one of the clearest and most well-documented cracks in the materialist model, the placebo effect. For centuries, medicine has sought to treat illness through external physical interventions, drugs, surgeries, procedures. The entire system is built on the assumption that healing comes from mechanistic processes. And yet there's a strange and persistent anomaly. Imagine two patients with the same condition. One receives a powerful new drug, the other receives a sugar pill, a tablet containing nothing but inert ingredients. No active chemicals, no medicinal properties at all. The expectation is that only the patient receiving the real drug should improve, but that's not what happens. Again and again, patients who receive the placebo improve, sometimes just as much as those receiving the actual drug. This effect is not minor, it is not occasional, it is so powerful and so consistent that every major drug trial is required to account for it. The word placebo comes from Latin, I shall please, and in medical terms it refers to an inert treatment that somehow produces real physiological effects. Medical researchers use placebos as a control in drug trials. Half of the participants receive the real drug, the other half receive a placebo. If the drug is effective, it should outperform the placebo group, yet even those who receive the sugar pill often improve. This is the placebo response, and it should be impossible under materialism, since consciousness is considered an epiphenomenon with no power to influence physical reality. A groundbreaking study by psychologist Irving Kirsch assessed the 6 most widely prescribed antidepressants approved by the FDA between 1987 and 1999. His findings were startling. 80% of the drug's effects were matched by the placebo group. This means that almost all of the improvements seen in patients was not due to the drug itself, but to their expectation of healing. Materialism has no explanation for this. There is no known physical mechanism by which belief alone should be able to alter neurochemistry, trigger immune responses, or promote tissue repair, and yet it happens. Seth described the body as being aware at every level, with each cell responding to the directives of consciousness. The placebo effect is not an anomaly, it is an illustration of how deeply belief shapes physical reality. But if belief can heal, can it also harm? If the mind can heal the body, then it can also destroy it. This is the nocebo effect, the dark twin of the placebo response. Just as positive expectation can restore health, negative expectation can bring about disease, even death. There are documented cases of patients who were misdiagnosed with terminal cancer. Believing they were dying, they wasted away, only for an autopsy to reveal no cancer at all. Their bodies obeyed the expectation of death. One of the most extraordinary cases involved a cancer patient on the verge of death. He learned about an experimental drug called crebiozin and begged his doctor to try it. Within days, his tumors shrank to half their size. Within 10 days, he was walking around in perfect health. Then he read a news article questioning the drug's effectiveness. Almost immediately his cancer returned. His doctor, realizing the power of belief, lied to him, telling him that an improved version of the drug had been developed. He injected him again, this time with nothing but a saline solution. Again the tumors disappeared. For 2 months he remained in perfect health, but then the final verdict came. The drug was officially declared worthless. Within days the cancer had returned worse than ever, and the patient almost immediately died. How does materialism explain this? It doesn't. Rupert Sheldrake states it plainly: if materialism were an adequate foundation for medicine, placebo responses ought not to occur. The fact that they do occur means that the mechanistic model is broken. It means that belief is not just a psychological state. It is a force that shapes biology. But if the mind can reshape the body, can it also reshape an entire species? The influence of consciousness does not stop at the level of the individual. There is another anomaly, one that suggests that learning itself is stored outside the brain, not just within the neural structures of a single being, but within an entire species-wide field of consciousness. This phenomenon was first noticed in experiments that unintentionally challenged one of the central tenets of Darwinian evolution. These studies suggested that knowledge and learning are not passed on solely through genetic inheritance or direct teaching, but through an invisible field that links members of a species. If this is true, it would mean that intelligence is not confined to individual minds. It would mean that once something is learned by a few, it becomes easier for others of the same species to learn it, no matter where they are or whether they have direct contact with the original learners. This defies conventional explanations, yet the experiments that uncovered it were rigorous, repeatable, and well documented. The first indication that something strange was happening came from experiments on rats. In the 1920s, Harvard psychologist William McDougall conducted a 15-year experiment training rats to escape a water maze. At first, the learning process was slow. Rats made an average of 165 errors before successfully navigating the maze. But something remarkable happened. With each new generation, the rats learned faster. By the third generation, the average errors had dropped to 56. By the 30th generation, it had fallen to just 20 errors. At first, researchers assumed this must be an example of Lamarckian inheritance, the idea that learned behaviors can be passed down genetically, a theory long dismissed by mainstream biology. But McDougall made a crucial mistake. He did not test rats from untrained parents to see if they learned at the same improved rate. His results were criticized for this, but rather than dismiss the effect, researchers in Scotland and Australia decided to put it to the test. Francis Crewe at Edinburgh University and Wilfred Agar in Melbourne repeated McDougall's experiment, but this time they tested the offspring of both trained and untrained rats. What they found shocked the scientific community. The improvement was not just happening in rats whose parents had been trained. All rats in each new generation were learning faster, even those that had no direct lineage to the original trained rats. And then came the most astonishing result. Agar's experiment in Melbourne showed that rats from the same genetic strain but raised on the other side of the world also learned the maze faster, even though their ancestors had never been trained. This should have been impossible. How could knowledge be passed between rats that had never met, never shared DNA, never communicated? Mainstream biology had no answer. Rupert Sheldrake, a biologist who studied these anomalies, proposed a radical new theory: morphic resonance. He suggested that learning is not confined to an individual brain but is stored in a species-wide field. According to Sheldrake, all members of a species are connected through a non-physical field of consciousness that acts as a collective memory. Whenever something is learned by a few members, the knowledge is not just stored in their individual brains, but is imprinted into the morphic field, making it easier for all members of the species to access it. Just as iron filings align themselves along the field lines of a magnetic field, biological organisms at the cellular, neurological and behavioral levels may be aligning with morphic fields that shape the very patterns of learning, memory and evolution. If this is true, it would mean that the mind does not exist solely inside the brain. It exists in an interconnected web of consciousness shared among all members of a species, and this effect isn't limited to rats. The same strange pattern of learning has been observed in humans. In 1982, researchers noticed an anomaly in IQ scores in Japan. They had been rising at a steady rate of 3% per decade since World War II. At first, this was dismissed as an isolated cultural phenomenon, but then the same effect was found in 20 other countries. Psychologist James Flynn detected this pattern while studying US military IQ tests. He found that recruits who scored average when compared to their contemporaries scored above average when compared to recruits from earlier generations, even though they were taking the exact same test. This meant that intelligence itself was increasing across generations, even in countries where formal education had not changed significantly. The phenomenon, now called the Flynn effect, has baffled mainstream scientists for decades. Why would IQ scores rise across entire populations without a clear environmental or educational cause? Materialist science has no answer. But under morphic resonance, the explanation becomes clear. As knowledge expands, it becomes easier for future generations to access it. The mental breakthroughs of one generation create a ripple effect in the collective human consciousness, making higher levels of intelligence more accessible to all. This aligns perfectly with Seth's description of how individual efforts affect the whole. The framework is so woven that each particle is dependent upon every other. The striving of one increases the potentiality of everything that is. Seth described human consciousness as being fundamentally interwoven, meaning that when one person expands their awareness, it alters the entire framework of reality. This means that personal growth is not just an isolated achievement, it is an act of species-wide evolution. When you change the character of the ego as you think of it, Seth said, you change it not only for yourselves but for the species of which you are a part. This is a revolutionary idea. It suggests that our personal insights, breakthroughs and efforts toward greater awareness do not benefit us alone. They alter the potential of the entire human race. If morphic resonance is real, it destroys the idea that the mind is an isolated phenomenon trapped inside a biological brain. It suggests that memory, learning and intelligence operate on a field-based model, not an individual storage model. It means that evolution is not purely genetic, but is influenced by consciousness itself. It explains why people today seem to absorb knowledge faster than their ancestors, why breakthroughs in thought spread rapidly across the world, and why some discoveries seem to appear simultaneously in different locations, as if multiple people are tapping into the same field of insight. It also means that each of us is far more powerful than we have been led to believe. Our personal efforts toward awareness, our moments of clarity, our learning, our struggles for deeper understanding do not vanish into the void. They change the entire species. And if this is true, then consciousness is not confined to the individual self. It is not confined to the brain. It extends outward, linking all members of a species together, forming an invisible web of intelligence that grows with every thought, every insight, every moment of understanding. At the deepest levels of biology, where molecules twist and fold into the structures that sustain life, we encounter yet another mystery that materialism cannot explain. The folding of proteins is one of the most fundamental processes in living organisms. Proteins are the building blocks of life, responsible for everything from cellular function to immune response, yet the way they take shape, their precise three-dimensional folding, presents a mathematical impossibility under mainstream evolutionary theory. If consciousness extends beyond the brain, if it operates at deep biological levels, then we may have found one of its clearest fingerprints, a fingerprint that modern science refuses to acknowledge. Proteins are made of long chains of amino acids. These chains are assembled according to genetic instructions encoded in DNA, which determines the sequence of amino acids. But DNA does not determine how a protein will fold, and folding is everything. A protein's function is determined entirely by its shape. If a protein folds incorrectly, it will fail to function, leading to cellular damage or disease. Misfolded proteins are linked to some of the most devastating neurodegenerative diseases known to science, including Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's disease, and cystic fibrosis. In these disorders, proteins take the wrong shape, become dysfunctional, and cause catastrophic effects. Yet, despite the life or death importance of proper folding, science has no explanation for how proteins know what shape to take. And this is where the problem gets even stranger. For a single protein of just 150 amino acids, there are trillions of possible ways it could fold. If a protein had to explore every possibility at random, it would take an estimated 10 to the power of 26 years, far longer than the lifetime of the universe, to arrive at the correct shape. And yet, inside a living cell, a protein folds itself correctly in about 2 minutes. This should not be possible. This is known in biology as the multiple minimum problem. Proteins always fold into the most stable, lowest energy shape, called a minimum energy state. But how do they know which one to choose when so many options exist? DNA does not tell them. Chemical interactions do not have time to guide them. Random chance would take an eternity. So what is guiding them? This is a fundamental violation of materialist assumptions. Some kind of directive intelligence is at work. Recently, artificial intelligence programs have made significant progress in predicting protein folding. Google's DeepMind developed AlphaFold, an AI capable of predicting the final shape of a protein with about 90% accuracy. This is a huge breakthrough for medical science, but it does not solve the mystery. AI can predict how a protein will fold, but it cannot explain why it folds that way. It does not tell us what force is guiding each molecular twist and turn inside a living cell. This is a key distinction. AI analyzes data and makes statistical predictions, while proteins in a living body act with certainty in real time without delay. Something far more immediate and intrinsic is at work inside the cell. AI models are external observers, making educated guesses based on vast amounts of pre-existing data. Proteins, on the other hand, fold themselves into perfect shapes instantaneously, without any external data, without trial and error, without hesitation. This is not the same process. It suggests the presence of an internal organizing force. Seth describes the body as having its own form of conscious awareness, extending down to the cellular and molecular level. Each cell is part of a larger field of intelligence that guides its functions. This is why the body heals wounds, fights disease, and maintains balance, not through mechanical processes alone, but through an underlying consciousness that directs it. According to Seth, the same mechanism that governs healing and regeneration may also be responsible for guiding protein folding. If this is true, it would explain why proteins fold into their correct shapes instantly and consistently, defying the limitations of materialist physics. Just as species-wide learning suggests that knowledge is stored in a morphic field, the precise organization of molecules and proteins suggests that the body itself is operating within a field of intelligence. A field that knows what structure a protein must take, that choreographs biological processes in ways beyond mere chemical interactions, and operates outside of genetic coding and mechanical causation. This would mean that even at the molecular level, life is not random. It is guided by an underlying intelligence. If protein folding is not random, if it is not purely chemical, then we are looking at direct evidence of intelligence operating beyond physical laws. Science cannot explain why proteins fold so quickly, why they always settle on the correct shape, or why they can find a solution faster than any known physical process allows. Seth's perspective provides a radical but coherent answer. The body is not just a machine, it is an aware intelligence system responding to directives from consciousness itself. This is why healing is not just a mechanical process, and why placebos work. Belief influences biology. The mind is not separate from the body is an extension of the mind, a physical expression of consciousness. And if consciousness is actively shaping biological processes, then materialism is not just flawed, it is irrelevant. If intelligence is present, even at the molecular level, if it operates beyond time constraints and outside genetic instructions, then what does this mean for the nature of reality itself? If materialism cannot even explain how proteins fold, how can it explain how consciousness interacts with reality? Materialism as a worldview rests on the assumption that consciousness is nothing more than a byproduct of the brain, a transient illusion with no independent existence. If this assumption were ever shown to be incorrect, if even a single instance of psi, any instance of consciousness reaching beyond the brain, were demonstrated to be real, the entire materialist model would collapse. The philosopher and psychologist William James made this point with elegant simplicity when he wrote, "If you wish to upset the law that all crows are black, it is enough if you prove one single crow to be white." The implications of this statement are profound. If consciousness can in any way transcend the physical body, if it can perceive events at a distance, influence the material world, or persist beyond death, then the fundamental tenets of materialism are invalidated. This is why the defenders of materialism must reject psi in its entirety. They cannot afford to concede even a single genuine case. Their approach is not to weigh the evidence neutrally, but to ensure, by whatever means necessary, that all such evidence is dismissed, minimized, or explained away. The strategies they employ are predictable. Every report of psi phenomena, whether it be telepathy, precognition, remote viewing, psychokinesis, or out-of-body perception, is invariably attributed to coincidence, statistical error, experimenter bias, or outright fraud. The mere existence of one confirmed case of psi would be enough to overturn materialism, so skeptics must demand that every single instance of psi be accounted for in conventional terms, no matter how improbable or contrived those explanations might be. One of the most commonly used tactics in dismissing evidence for psi is the principle that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. On the surface, this phrase appears reasonable. Surely the more radical a claim, the stronger the evidence required to support it. However, in practice, this principle is used as an intellectual sleight of hand, allowing skeptics to discard inconvenient evidence by simply declaring it insufficiently extraordinary. The real problem lies in the fact that skeptics themselves claim the authority to decide what constitutes extraordinary evidence. The goalposts are continually moved. No matter how compelling a study may be, no matter how rigorous its controls, skeptics retain the ability to insist that it still does not rise to their ever-shifting standard of proof. This creates a closed system of belief, one in which no amount of evidence will ever be enough. As Richard Wiseman, one of the more intellectually honest skeptics, admitted in a 2008 interview, the experimental results supporting remote viewing are so strong that by the standards of any other area of science, remote viewing is proven. Yet despite this admission, Wiseman still refused to accept that remote viewing is real, simply because its existence would violate the materialist paradigm. This is not scientific skepticism, it is dogmatism masquerading as rationality. The philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn argued that the best scientific theories are those that not only explain known phenomena, but also unify disparate observations and provide new insights into unexplained mysteries. A good theory should not just fit existing data, but should also reveal deeper patterns and interconnections that were previously overlooked. If this is the measure of a strong scientific theory, then materialism has failed, while a consciousness-based model succeeds. Materialism struggles to explain psi, near-death experiences, the placebo effect, species-wide learning, and even fundamental biological processes such as protein folding. By contrast, the view that consciousness is primary, that it extends beyond the brain, and that it interacts with the physical world in complex ways, provides a unifying explanation for these otherwise disconnected anomalies. In light of all the evidence considered so far, it seems reasonable to conclude that the existence of psi is not an extraordinary claim at all. It is an empirical reality. The real extraordinary claim is the materialist's insistence that consciousness is an accidental byproduct of neural activity, with no causal influence of its own. This claim flies in the face of experimental evidence, the lived experience of millions of people, and the growing body of scientific data that suggests otherwise. The materialist position is demonstrably false, and to continue clinging to it in the face of contrary evidence is to engage in willful denial. But there remains one final question, one that materialism refuses to ask. If consciousness is not confined to the brain, if it can affect matter and range through space and time, then can it continue to exist in the absence of a functioning brain? Can consciousness survive the death of the body, the death of the brain? The answer to that question may be the most important discovery of all. In the next episode, we will examine the near-death experience and the growing scientific evidence that suggests consciousness continues even after the brain ceases to function. If you're ready to take the next step, join us, because the final frontier isn't space, it's the mind. Until next time, like and subscribe and share your views in the comments below. Thank you all for watching.